finish 6 in class. And then my plan is maybe get into 7. I haven't decided yet. I'm going to break that down. Then my plan is I forgot we had singing on the fourth Sunday. I didn't preach. So I'm still going to preach another lesson on the Sermon on the Mount next Sunday, the last half of Matthew 7. So I'm sneaking in 6 lessons on this one. But I don't think it's too much. It's just so rich. And I think it's so needful for us. Let's pause and pray for this moment. Father, we're grateful for the night's rest, for this new day, for this Lord's Day that you have blessed us with, to come and to worship and honor you, and that we might join together in fellowship. We're grateful for this period of Bible study, and as we dig into your Sermon on the Mount that you have given us, help us, Father, not only to study this in a way that we might understand it, but more better that we might apply it in our lives and become more like Christ in all that we say, do, and think. Bless us in our activities as we wait before you today. Bless those that are part of our church family that are not with us, who may be sick or suffering, and be with those that are mourning the loss of loved ones, and provide for each one according to their special needs, according to your will. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. I referred to this last week as the radical teachings of Jesus, and by the world standards, this is pretty radical stuff, isn't it? And we're going to look at some things today that the world would consider radical. That's crazy. In fact, remember I was reading these quotes last week from students from Texas A&M. Yeah, I actually found a great quote for some students from Texas A&M. And one student in an English class said that the Sermon on the Mount was the most stupid thing they'd ever read. Can you imagine saying something about Jesus? The most stupid thing you'd ever read. But that's the world. The world looks at these things. We're going about lust. Well, I mean, our whole world is focused on things that provoke lust, really. I mean, think about it, from advertising to movies to everything else. So it's radical. In today's text, in Matthew chapter 5 and beginning in verse 17, Jesus said, "Do not think that I'm come to destroy the law or the prophets. I do not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For surely I say to you, till heaven and earth shall pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass the law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." And then here's a key verse, I think, in the Sermon on the Mount, verse 20. "For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter to the kingdom of heaven." And so we think of the idea of righteousness. Jesus' righteousness. Last week we talked about righteousness, the Beatitudes. And what did Jesus say about righteousness? Beatitudes? Rest of what? Yes, Christy? Yeah, we should hunger and thirst after righteousness. Here he says our righteousness needs to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And then we're going to see some other verses as we go through these 3 chapters about righteousness. Now, let's talk a little bit here about law. What is the law referring to here, do you think? Okay, Kevin? Okay. It may very well refer to the law of Moses. Now, we know in the Bible, and, you know, I know I say this all the time, you know, we can take the whole lesson just on this passage. I mean, there's just so much here that we can't. So, but just to bullet this, the word law is used in Romans 7:7 to just refer to the 10 Commandments. So sometimes the law is used that way. Or in Matthew 12, Jesus refers to the Pentateuch as being law. The Psalms Jesus referred to as the law in John 10. Or it may refer to the entire Old Testament that Kevin really alludes to here. Ephesians 2:15, having abolished his flesh, the law of commandments. There was an aspect, though, in that time where it also could refer to the scribal or oral law. And the word was commonly used and included The Jews, the scribes and the Pharisees and the doctors of the law included the scribal or oral law. That's very common. Barclay, in his commentary, says about the scribal law, they held that that law was divine, and that in it God had said His last word, and therefore everything must be in it. If a thing was not in the law explicitly, it must be there implicitly. And then he says this: they therefore argue that out of the law it must be possible to deduce a rule and a regulation for everything possible in every situation of life. So there arose a race of men called the scribes, who made it the business of their lives to reduce the great principles of the law literally to thousands upon thousands of rules and regulations. So I wonder, I think Kevin is right. I think probably Jesus is referring to the entirety of the Old Testament law. And yet, there was an aspect, the way they're going to hear this is to thinking about all the things that they attached to it. And they did attach a lot of things. The scribes, of course, what was their role? It's almost an inherent word. The scribes did what? Huh?
Write down, record.
The recorder write down. They were copyists of the law. And as a result, they were considered experts in the law. We know from Mark 12 that they loved to be recognized. They loved the praise of men because of this. And we will read a number of times in the life of Christ, they were very hostile toward Jesus. The Pharisees, what does the word Pharisee mean? It means what? I know? No? Separatists. They were the separatists. And they set themselves apart, and they were very strict. You had the Pharisees and Sadducees. The Sadducees were the liberals. The Pharisees were the conservatives in our nomenclature today. The Pharisees, though, were, I guess, if in our way of saying things, we call them ultra-conservative. They, as I suggested already, went beyond the law to the point of their rules and regulations, looking at that as important as the law. And we'll see in the life of Christ when Jesus condemned them, their laws and their ordinances, that they may not affect the law of God because of that. They were in constant conflict with Jesus as we unfold the life of Christ. So it's not surprising here that in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus is beginning by probably undermining somewhat their attitude here about the law. And of course they neglected waiting for what Jesus said in Matthew 22. Yes, ma'am. John 10:34, I think. Is that right? That's the verse I have written here. I think that's right, John 10:34. Well, the reason I say, he said, is it not written in your law? And he quotes from the Psalms. And so my point is, sometimes, people will try to extract and say the law was just the Ten Commandments, or the law was just the Pentateuch. And these verses prove that the entirety of it was the law. The entire Old Testament was a part of the law. The Psalms, the prophets, and everything. Yes, sir.
Jesus summed it up in one sentence in Matthew 7:12.
Yeah, he did. We'll get to that. All right, so what was Jesus' relationship to the law, according to this? You? He was under the law? Okay. What else? Based just on this verse. Yes, Gordon. Okay, he came to fulfill the law. He says, now I didn't come to destroy the law or the prophets, but I came to fulfill the law. Now, what's the difference between abolishing the law and destroying the law? Because we look in this passage, and he says that I came not to destroy, and yet we read in Ephesians 2 that it's abolished. So what's the difference between destroying and abolishing? Okay, Richard?
The scribes and the Pharisees and Sadducees destroyed the law. That's what they did to it.
Okay, you could say that, yeah, because of what they did and perverted it, undermined it, yeah. Well, here's what I'm thinking of is a distinction here. That Jesus and the Pharisees looked at him as some kind of a rebel that was, trying to destroy what they were doing and undermine what they were doing. But Jesus didn't come as a rebel in destruction and demolishment of the law of Moses, but historically say he came in fulfillment. The law spoke of Jesus. Romans 10:4 said, Christ is the end of the law, or the consummation of the fulfillment of the law. And Galatians 3:24 tells us that it was the law that brought us to Christ. And so when we look at the law, Jesus is the consummation of everything the law had to say. The law brought us to Jesus Christ. So, I know this question is not in your book, so I just want you to think about the conclusions that you draw from these contrasts that he's going to make here about the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. So let me just share some things here before we get into this. Part of their problem is they relied too much on what they had heard as opposed to what was really so. And here he said, you have heard that it's been said with them of old time. Well, what had they heard? Well, what they had heard was a lot from the oral law was the interpretation of the opinion. And so, we still run into that day sometimes. I preach things, someone say, well, I've never heard it that way before. Or, well, I've always heard. Well, the preachers I've always heard. Or my granddaddy said. See? And that can happen to us in the Lord's church. See? Tradition. And they had a problem. Okay, Kevin.
Well, no, your point is valid. It says that ye have not heard. It didn't say it is written, right? There's a difference in the terms. Jesus used, when he quoted scripture, it is written. He's saying you have heard.
Yeah.
The conflict wasn't with the law of the Pharisees.
Exactly. That's where the conflict was, Richard.
Well, similar to what Kevin said, when he was tempted of Satan, he kept referring to the scriptures that
right.
it is written,
right.
not what you have heard.
Exactly. All right. And they have become focused on the outward appearance rather than the heart. And we're going to see that over and over again. So, and then I suggest they were more rule-driven than relationship-driven. And the Lord wants us to have a relationship with him. Now, I'm going to say some things different times, so I want to make a disclaimer now. Everybody got this? Everybody with me? I know that we've been given laws under the law of Christ. And I'm not ever suggesting that we can have a relationship with the Lord that's right and not obey him. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Okay? I believe that. I preach that. I'm going to promote that. However, it is possible for us to be so focused on every rule. And even, see, we have our own scribes and Pharisees in the Lord's church today. Okay? Well, that's another sermon. And if we're not careful, then we can rely on what they said instead of what Christ said. And then we can become like the Pharisees, become rule-driven instead of relationship-driven. Now, let me illustrate this, because Jesus says here, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness scribes and the Pharisees, you shall no wise enter the kingdom of heaven. So, as I say, the Pharisees and scribes were outwardly focused. Jesus wants his disciples to be inwardly focused. The scribes and Pharisees were self-righteous. He wants us to have spiritual righteousness. They were concerned about the ceremonial aspects of the law, as we're going to see as we go through different studies in this quarter. Jesus' disciples are to look at the moral aspects of what he says. They were insincere. I mean, there's just no question that as a large body of people, and Jesus calls them out for their insincerity, we're to be sincere of heart of what we're doing. They had a contempt for sinners. This comes out repeatedly in Jesus' interaction with sinners and with them. We're to have a love for sinners. They had become very sectarian. They didn't think they had, but they had. We're to seek unity among God's people. They have become ritualistic in their approach to things. Our obedience is to stem from the heart. And they become harsh in their judgments toward others. And the Lord wants us to be humble as we approach things. So, we might talk about this as righteousness from the inside out. In other words, the heart of the matter is a matter of the heart. And so when we think about becoming like Christ, and this fits in so well, Tim, with our theme, if we're going to become like Christ and be righteous, it's not that we have a checklist of 100 things, that we check these all off, and that we're keeping all these rules and regulations, but is the heart right with God? And so the righteousness starts within and filter itself outwardly. And that would be true in everything of life. Everything that we do. All of our actions, you see, that begin inside. And if the heart is right, then ultimately,
how, Catholicism and liberal, but we forget both are sinners. And the only thing that God has come to call out in his righteousness is Christians. So we wear certain political badges as if it's like a badge of honor.
Yeah.
Neither is what God is about.
Yeah.
He calls sinners out, and he's calling sinners out from both the Pharisees and Sadducees.
Right.
We miss that.
Right.
And here we see all of that as we pointed out. Where do you expect to address the trust? Very much so. It's not saying that. But the king was his name. If you without sin for us, right there, you always come from the heart first, and that's where Christianity ought to start.
Amen.
So I agree with you. It's not about, this is not disobeying God's law. This is recognizing the compassion, the mercy that is in God's law.
Amen. Any comment? Yes, sir.
Back to your chart. Kind of, to me, what that means is if you find that you're not doing something because somebody might see you do it, versus you're not doing it because God sees you.
That's a good observation. Right. Before we move on. So, you have and really they all speak to this principle of righteousness from the inside. You see. And if Jesus is talking about things that it said. And much of what he said, there is a specificity down in the wall, but never that and back to that, he said that yes. Just since I we're there I into you. In most languages, I know Spanish is way that if you can have the noun on the end of a verb, it's one word. And I think Spanish people, in an O that you have on the end of a word, and so you can have the noun and the verb in one word, like I say. Well, that's true in the Greek as well, okay? But in the manuscripts, you can also have the word I as a separate word. Well, in the manuscripts, you have the verb with the subject I, but you also have the I. So Jesus is emphasizing. In other words, it would be like this. Translate that I say it. I've heard him say I take this. And so you go without. The emphasis Jesus is putting what he say as opposed to what it is taken. Now probably everybody here mentioned something. suggest that all of these speaking to an issue of a contrast between the inside and the outside. So we begin with the idea of attitudes. Well, obviously, that they've been transcribed and translated in English that you can read. It's incredible of all the different rules and regulations that they came up. And so most, if not all of these 6 things, Jesus had some allusion here to this. So yeah, murder is a sin, although they had perverted it and they said you're in danger of judgment. But Jesus takes that to another level, that it's not just the outward act of taking someone's life, but it's the inward hatred that you have toward someone else. Whether it is anger that is provoked, or it is a name that was a term like Reka, means a senseless, empty-headed person. It was a term of reproach used among the Jews. Or the word fool that was used in a very derogatory term. But all of these speak to the idea of an anger that is inward, that may not take one's life, but is wrong. And so when you think of ways that we might be guilty, not of murder, but of the inward attitude of anger, how might we be guilty of the attitude of hatred, you think? Any thought? What's that? Okay, of getting even with people. It may be the malicious gossip. I mean, why do people gossip about other people? Because they love them? They want their best interest? They want to help them? No. People, malicious gossip, which is almost repetitious to say malicious gossip, because that's really what gossip is, indicates an attitude of the heart that is not right. Or words that we use that are unkind, words that are hurtful words, or judging the motives of another person. We're not careful, we can get very judgmental about other people that is a display of an inward attitude. And we may never reach a point where we would murder someone, but Jesus says it's just as wrong to hate, and in ways in which we may display that hate. Okay. Anybody have a question or comment? Because if I get through all of these 6, I need your help with this. But we will get through them, because if I don't have your help, I'll just keep going next week. We may do 4 lessons of Sermon on the Mount. Just a thought. Just a thought. Yeah.
You could add bitterness to there too.
You what?
Bitterness. You can add bitterness.
Bitterness. Bitterness. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, my mother always taught us as kids that it takes a lot more to hate than to love. Hatred is something that will just eat you from the inside out.
Right. Well, inside out. That's a good thought. All right.
Just remember the scripture, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord.
Yeah, Romans 12. Yeah, at the end of Romans 12, about 17, 18 along in there. Okay. Well, and each one of these, again, there's 6 sermons here. 6 classes. If I keep saying that, Christy, how many lessons would I have on the Sermon on the Mount? 39 lessons on the Sermon on the Mount, right? I mean, it'd be a bunch. But, I mean, it's just so rich. Well, then he talks here about what we might call affairs of the heart. The problem of lust, the look of lust. The 7th commandment condemned adultery. The 10th commandment condemned desiring another man's wife. And yet, we understand that God made us with sexual desires. So you have a balance here. You know, Dane did a wonderful job on Wednesday night a few weeks ago talking about the Song of Solomon. And what he described, I thought so wonderfully at that class, spoke of a sexual desire that is a holy sexual desire that a man and a woman ought to have for each other. I mean, sexual desires are an element in procreation. They're the healthy pleasure the wise man talked about in Proverbs 5 of marriage. Hebrews 13:4 says that they're honorable in the bed of marriage. And so it's not the sexual desire that is wrong, but it is the look of lust. Now, interestingly, the word lust comes from a Greek word that means a strong desire for a thing, to long after a thing. But you know, it is the same word that Paul uses in Philippians 1, that he has a desire to part and be with Christ. Same Greek word. It's a strong desire. So the word can be used in a good sense or a bad sense. You say, how do you know the difference? Well, context. Context. Here it's apparent, the context, that he's using desire in a bad sense. That you look upon a woman with an unholy desire, with an unrighteous desire, with a desire that is adulterous in its nature. And while adultery is wrong, adultery degrades those involved. It defrauds a spouse. It devastates innocent children. It destroys homes. It disgraces the cause of Christ. It defiles the body. It damages one spiritually. It displeases God. And it will condemn the soul. Adultery is bad. But guess what? Lust is also wrong too, you see. So, how do you distinguish between love and lust? How do you distinguish between love and lust? What's the difference? Dorothy? Okay, they're both a choice. Good. What else? What are the distinguishing marks between love and lust? Or we could say sexual desire. Let's just say sexual desire in married love and sexual desire that is outside of married love. Yes?
Lust is focused on my desires, and maybe love is focused on fulfilling the needs of someone else.
Very good. Yeah. That lust is focused on my own fulfillment. Lust is selfish. Love seeks the welfare of others. Lust seeks its own interest. Love delights in the pleasure of others. Lust self-gratification. Love gives, takes. So, in young people, I've taught college classes before on the Sermon on the Mount or on issues like this, and students seriously are concerned, or they're spiritual and want to do right. Say, "Well, I'm dating this girl, and I'm having some feelings for it. I'm concerned of my feelings, wrong feelings." Well, there is a balance there, isn't there? That you probably don't want to marry someone that you have no desire for, no romantic interest in, and yet you have that romantic interest, a sexual desire, let's just say it, and yet you've got to bridle that sexual desire. See, you've got to bridle that, and you've got to harness that, and you have to realize that sexual desire, by God's plan, can only be legitimately fulfilled in the bed of marriage. So, you understand? Now, we have a big issue today with pornography. Just rampant in our culture today. A person may never commit adultery, but they may be guilty of lust. And so we have to be careful. And this is put upon men. And you say, well, why does he say men? Well, because I think, not that a woman can't lust, women can, but I think men probably have a greater weakness. The way God made us, we probably have a greater weakness for that. Just as he puts immodesty on the woman to be modest, can a man be immodest? Sure. But maybe there's a greater propensity among the female to be immodest, you suppose. And so, or lust and bring it out in a way. Boy, I mean, that was a multitude of sins that we had a whole class talk about. Maybe we'll come back later. And that leads us into the sanctity of marriage and the bonds of marriage. I know that in the past couple of years that this has been discussed in some detail here. Of course, I know not everybody's been here, during those classes that you all had, Tim, and has discussed that. And I think I've had a sermon on it in the past couple of years, and there'll be others. So we can't take the kind of time that this justifies to think about this. But Jesus makes it clear in this passage about the marriage bond, doesn't he? Now, What about divorce in that time? Was divorce ever allowed? Divorce was allowed. Okay, divorce was allowed. But what was God's man? So this is conservative than God is. We don't want to be more liberal than God is. I've known sometimes their brethren that say you can't ever get divorced. Well, no, wait a minute. Jesus gave a scriptural reason that you can put your spouse. That when the bed of marriage is defiled, when there's sexual unfaithfulness, you have the right to do that. Okay, that breaks that bond. You have the right to do that. And so I don't want to make a rule there and put guilt on people when they exercise that scriptural prerogative. Yet on the other hand, I don't want to open this up for any kind of frivolous, kind of a thought or a reason. And so we need to stick to what Jesus had to say about this. Any thought that you'd like to add or comment or question? Sure, Dave.
So this is consistent with what the Old Testament is. When you read
It is.
the account of you see that literally the man wasn't allowed to just divorce for any reason. He
Right.
had to verify they commit sex. Something more before he we lose
I guess he's got policy. Okay. So the law, Exodus 20:16, you'll not bear witness against your brother. And Lewisville Numbers as well, talk about that. But the problem in Jesus' day was frivolous swearing and taking an oath where there was no need and using sacred things in a lewd and unholy way. There was a problem of evasive swearing. The Jews developed a practice of finding loopholes. They said, an oath contained the name of it must be. But if it did not contain the name of some form, it was nothing. So that's what Jesus talked about certain things that can get around this, because I didn't actually invoke the name of God. No, that's not what Jesus is talking about here. It comes back attitude of the heart. It comes back to something is hidden. Now, I've heard rather in this, and I think it's fine, and we can't take it to court. We swear to do truth about somebody said no. Well, if you did, if that meant then you violating commandment, Matthew 26:3, we took those out. Right? He did. And Paul violated it when Paul under a number of times. 2 Corinthians 1:20, we want to close up. So that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about frivolous swearing, evasive swearing, of using God's name in an unholy kind of a way. Now, how do people sin in taking oaths today, you think? If it's okay to take an oath in a court of law, how might we sin in taking an oath? You thought? Okay.
Whether you take an oath or whether you just tell someone a lie, it's a lie.
Yeah.
If you break that oath, you're lying.
But what do people do a lot of times even when they lie about something, and they maybe have to invoke God's name? Don't they? Have you ever heard someone do that? Invoke God's name that this is the truth? Blank, blank, this is the truth. When a person has to start invoking sacred things and God's name to save time, I always get a little suspicious. Are they really telling me the truth or not? Jesus said, let your yes be yes, ma'am.
I had to get after them at one point because I said, well, I didn't say I promised. I said I would do something, but I didn't say I promised. No, you said it, you were promising, but you were promising.
Yeah, see, that's kind of like the Jews did. They were trying to find loopholes. Yeah. Okay, Kevin.
You just said it's a false swearing or forbidding deception. The Jews usually say, well, if you didn't swear by this, you didn't have to keep it, right?
Yeah.
Some history on that, right? But that's one of the loopholes, right? That they were, if you didn't swear by this, then you didn't have to do it, right?
Wrong. Then he talks about second mile living and practicing non-retaliation. Now the law had some. Deuteronomy 19, talks about this, as well as other places. But the law in both Exodus and Leviticus had a great deal to say about legal retribution in the court system. And we don't have time to detail all of that, but you can look it up. You can run the reference on it. And so, but this is not what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about a retribution that we seek through the court system, but he's talking about taking vengeance. You referred to that passage a while ago, of us taking vengeance, you see, of practicing non-retaliation. What does he say today? Is to turn the other cheek. Is someone smites you, to turn the other cheek. Now, think about what you do. If someone slaps you across the cheek and you turn the other cheek and they come back across, what are they doing? Well, they're giving you a backhanded slap, aren't they? If they go like this and you turn the other cheek, they're giving you a backhanded slap, which would be the highest form of an insult. Turn the other cheek. Don't worry about your rights. Be willing to go the extra mile. So the question is, what do you do when someone, screams at you or curses you or cuts you off on the highway or waves at you and they don't use all their fingers? You know what I mean? Okay. You've had that happen. What do you do? Do you retaliate with that? Now, the idea of going the extra mile, you may have heard me say this in sermons before, or somebody, but Palestine, of course, was occupied by the Romans, and anytime a soldier would compel a Jew to supply food or carry baggage or whatever, they had to do what was necessary. And it was very distasteful to a Jew to have to be subjugated to a Roman ruler, but they had no choice. Well, Jesus is saying here, well, not only walk the mile and carry the soldiers' bags, but go too. Wow. Can you imagine doing that? And this, you come to these markers, and they had markers, and the soldier said, okay, you're releasing this, and you say, I've enjoyed your company so much, let me walk another mile. Let me carry your bags another mile. Huh? No Jew wants to do that. Well, you see, I'm a follower of Jesus. And Jesus has to go the second mile. I want to go above and beyond, you see. So we think of ways that we might do more than is expected in our jobs or our families or volunteer work or social work or relationships in our church family. How can we do that? All right. Then I've got a minute left. And actually, I'm going to mention this in my sermon this morning, so this is all good. Perfect love, of loving your enemies. And the Jews, again, had twisted this. They had ignored what the law said about taking care of the poor and the stranger and so on and so forth. And Jesus said that you need to love like God. Now, sometimes verse 48 is taken out of context. To be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. He didn't say that you're to be sinless. The word perfect there is from the Greek word teleos, which means complete or mature. And so is your love complete? You love those that love you. Well, that's well and good, but your love is incomplete if you don't love people that don't love you. And so God loves everybody, even those that don't love Him. And so when he says to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect, that didn't mean that you're sinless like God. It means in this context that you're perfect in your love, that you seek to love. Now, that almost may seem impossible. Is that hard? Yeah. That's really hard, to love people that don't like you, or to love the unlovely. there are some people that it's really hard to like them, let alone love them. But if we're to be a disciple of Christ, and if we're to become like Christ, then that would be a great thing for us to work on. So I'm going to talk about loving like Christ this morning. And you might think about, in some of these 6 things I'm going to talk about in my sermon, 2 or 3 of them might be really easy. This is one of the 6. This might be the hardest one. I don't know. And so, but if we're going to become like Christ, we might think about that. So the question is, are you really following Jesus? Following His footsteps? If you are, then you're going to become like Him. Well, we somehow made it. Thanks for coming. Let's have a great worship.